Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us for this launch of the OECD's 2024 Economic Survey of New Zealand. I'm Caralee, McLeish, the Secretary of the Treasury, and we're privileged to be joined today by the Honourable Nicola Willis, who is here in her capacity as the Minister of Finance to launch this report to the OECD. A very warm welcome to the Minister. And would also like to extend a very warm welcome to Clare Lombardelli, who's the Chief Economist at the OECD, who has travelled all the way from Paris yesterday to join us for this launch. Thank you so much for joining us, Clare. And welcome. Would also like to acknowledge and welcome Dr. David Haugh, who is a Senior Economist at the OECD and also head of the New Zealand desk, which produced this survey report. So thank you, David, also for travelling, and especially thank you to the behind the report. It's a pleasure to host everybody here in the Treasury's Whanganui, Ngā Motu. It's an appropriate place for this occasion. This Whanganui was built more than 3 decades ago by former Treasury leaders with a lot of foresight and stewardship. It is a place of connections. We connect within the Treasury, with our partners and stakeholders, and also across cultures. It's a place of history, which you can see in the carvings from Kite to Captain James Cook. And it's also a place where we come together to discuss, debate, and collaborate on some of the big issues that matter for New Zealand's economy, for our fiscal position, and for living standards more broadly. So it is an appropriate place to talk about the OECD's Economic Survey, in which we are acknowledging our really valued connections and history with the OECD, and also where we will hear the OECD's views on important policy challenges that are facing New Zealand. This 2024 OECD Economic Survey, it really is a significant piece of work. It covers macroeconomic developments as well as 3 special chapters on productivity, and on education, and on climate change. These are currently areas of some pretty major policy work in New Zealand, including for the Treasury. And the OECD, the Economic Survey, will have really valuable input to this policy work. We do make progress by debating and testing our ideas and by learning from others. We really value the OECD's perspectives informed by a range of other countries' experiences as well as their own analysis. So in terms of an agenda for today's launch, Clare Lombardelli will the presentation of the survey and its findings. The Minister of Finance will then share some reflections of government policy, and following this we'll open the floor to questions and answers for about 15 minutes before wrapping up. Finally, some housekeeping. There is no earthquake, please got cover of hold, and if we need to evacuate the building for any reason, the exit is to the right and then left, follow the green signs. So with that, it's now my pleasure to hand over to Clare Lombardelli for an overview of the survey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in New Zealand. It's a real privilege and a pleasure. I'd just like to start with some thanks. Huge thanks go from the OECD to people across academia, trade unions, business associations, the public and private sectors, for all the expert advice and feedback that's gone into the survey that we're launching here today. As you heard, this survey will assess New Zealand's progress in rebalancing the economy. It will recommend what further needs to be done, and it will focus on 3 structural challenges that would improve the life of all New Zealanders: boosting competition, school education, and then finally talking about climate change, both reducing emissions but also adapting to a hotter world. If we just start with the macroeconomic outlook, you can see here, so growth is relatively weak in the New Zealand economy. New Zealand's weathered a difficult period since 2020. It has performed more strongly than many economies through the COVID period, with a faster and a stronger bounce back, contributing in part to the inflation that came afterwards. But we've also seen falling real incomes, some slowing goods trade, and tightening monetary policy, and together those have reduced growth across the economy. So growth declined from a peak of over 6% in the annual numbers of 2021 to by last year. And however, the rapidly rising population and migration has limited the slowdown in growth that would have otherwise been seen. But GDP per capita is falling. It declined by 1.3% to December 2023. And with activity slowing, consumer price inflation has also fallen from the peak of 7.7% to the 4% that we see in the latest figures. So moving forward, showing here what's happened for tourism. So an increase in tourist arrivals has also been a support of growth. By February 2024, so that's this year, tourism had bounced back to 3/4 of the level it was at before COVID, and of course the ongoing re-establishment of flights to New Zealand will further support arrivals tourism. Looking at the current account, so current account deficit in New Zealand is very high by international standards and by New Zealand's own historical experience. These imbalances are partly cyclical and those are unwinding. So slower import growth and the increase in tourism has meant the current account deficit has shrunk from its 2022 peak of 8.8% that you can see here to 6.9% in the latest data. But this does remain well above the long-term average for New Zealand, and it is still one of the highest in the OECD. A further decline in the current accounts is expected, particularly if service exports continue to recover, including the tourism we talked about. But part of the widening deficit that we've seen is structural because of the fiscal deficit, and so action will be needed to reduce that further. Obviously, this remains a concern for the economy, as it means the economy is more exposed to investor sentiment and exchange rate depreciation. Looking at the data going forward and the expectations going forward, so GDP growth we project will slow in 2024, but will then pick up in 2025 as falling inflation further supports household income and consumption growth. And we project growth of 1.9% in 2025, which actually compares well to other advanced economies for that period. The growing shortage of housing and rising house prices and rents should eventually stimulate housing construction, while the global recovery will also boost exports in New Zealand. Inflation is projected to continue to fall as supply chain tensions ease, and see weaker demand and also a loosening in the labour market. Headline consumer inflation is projected to fall to 3.2% this year and then 2.4% next year. Just briefly pausing on the labour market, so we saw a large stock of vacancies post-COVID in 2022, and when borders reopened, then migrants and there was a lot of immigration, and migrants met a significant part of that demand for those workers. But labour demand is now weakening. We see vacancies are declining, and employment growth slowed quite sharply in the from the first to the second half of last year. The employment rate has risen from the 3.2% record low to 4%, and then we expect it to rise to 4.7% this year and 4.8% next year. So just to pause briefly on risks to the New Zealand economy, the main short-term risks are external, the large current account I talked about, which is due to a sort of structural deficits as well as cyclical factors. I mean, that leaves New Zealand vulnerable to investor sentiment and as I said, the exchange rate. Other external risks come from China, which is New Zealand's largest export market. An extended slowdown of the Chinese economy will see hit growth. Yeah, and there's also geopolitical risks that come from the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, which could lead to a negative shock if that was to expand and in particular affect commodity markets and that would increase inflation and have an impact on growth. On the upside, for New Zealand, stronger tourism growth could spark a more vigorous export-led recovery. In the medium term, the main risk comes from low growth, and like in other countries, labour productivity in New Zealand has fallen. It's roughly half compared to the pre-global financial crisis period. If the difference between that period and the period before the financial crisis and then in the period since is quite significant in terms of productivity growth in New Zealand. And then without structural reforms, that productivity growth won't increase, and that would, of course, undermine catch up with other higher income OECD economies. It would limit the capacity to deal with an aging population and provide the investments needed for the green transition. And without more growth, it would limit the ability to move to a sustainable fiscal position while maintaining quality public services. I'm going to move on and talk about macroeconomic policy. So macro policy has a critical role to play in rebalancing and in setting the stage for more sustained growth. Also, migration policy has an important play reducing labour shortages while not creating imbalances in terms of other markets, such as housing. So looking at monetary policy, at 4%, the inflation is well above the 1 to 3% target and is due to decline only slowly over the coming years. Obviously, services for inflation is persistent, especially faster rising rents and tight labour markets there. This, of course, restricts the ability to lower interest rates, and what we need to see is clear evidence that inflation will fall to the middle of that target range before the policy rate can be lowered. Moving on to fiscal policy, New Zealand has developed a relatively new and quite unwelcome structural deficit. Spending is now 5 percentage points of GDP higher than it was in 2018, including because of the generosity of welfare payments. But revenue's also been weaker than expected, which means that if medium-term spending plans set after COVID weren't adhered to, and you can see that in terms of what's happened on the spending side. What we recommend is that the government should set spending and tax policies to gradually reduce the fiscal deficit to reach a budget balance, and this will of course be supportive of monetary policy, allowing interest rates to fall sooner than they otherwise would be able to. On the revenue side, any tax cuts should be fully funded by offsetting revenue or expending measures. And we also talk in the survey about strengthening the framework to reduce the risk of spending slippage. The government could consider a formal fiscal target for new expenditure growth or monitoring, and this could supplement the operating balance target. It would improve transparency, it would strengthen incentives for better fiscal control, including through providing more information to the public and to Parliament. Looking at inward migration, New Zealand has seen very significant increases in inward migration in 2023. This has risen from an average of under 2% a year across the 2010 to 2019 period to well over 4% last year. This has helped ease labour shortages and so has helped mitigate some of the inflationary pressures, and it's supported growth, but it's also boosted housing demand, and rents for new tenancies rose by over 5% in the year to March, slowing the decline in inflation that we're seeing now. To ensure migration continues to be a positive for New Zealand, we recommend the government increase housing investment, physical capital, including maximising private sector provision of housing and ensuring that health, education and other public services meet the rising population needs. We also recommend ensuring that the type and the level of immigration matches what the labour market needs. So that can be done by focusing more on high-skilled migration, where labour shortages exist, increasing the minimum wage required for visas, strengthening the requirements to prove that a job could not be filled in New Zealand, monitoring changes to the employer accreditation and job checks, and then thinking about tightening them if employer abuse complaints don't fall substantially, and finally potentially considering a variable ban or a guide path on work visas, so that and delivering that potentially using a variable points-based system. Going to move on, I'm going to say we looked at three particular structural issues for the New Zealand economy in this survey. I'm going to talk about the first of those now, which is competition policy. So productivity growth is clearly key to living standards in the context of population ageing. Like elsewhere, productivity has slowed in New Zealand since the financial crisis, but it's also weak compared to other OECD countries. Competition plays a key role in productivity, and it's a particular risk for New Zealand where small markets can lead to small numbers of players. We see markets are more concentrated here than they are for other OECD countries, and we also see that large firms in New Zealand face weaker pressures to innovate, to seek efficiencies and to provide better services at lower prices. So ensuring competition meets best practice is particularly important in a small market like New Zealand. And we've seen some recent improvements, but there is more that could be done in this space. So if you look at barriers to entry, the OECD produces what we call product market regulation indicators. So we look across a whole range of sectors and assess how competitive they are and how efficiently products are produced and the dynamism of those markets. And what we see is quite a mixed picture in New Zealand that you can see here. In some areas, such as administration, regulatory burdens, and business operations, New Zealand performs very well. In other areas, such as impact evaluation and public ownership, the product market here is less strongly performing. So there's a range of tools that should be considered when thinking about competition policy. And this chart shows you that across a whole range of indicators, New Zealand has a business-friendly environment. You can see that here, though there are some issues and problems around lobbying and special interests there. And this broadly business-friendly environment is necessary, but it isn't sufficient to delivering the competitive markets needed for higher productivity and better choices for consumers. A more explicit policy strategy of escalation of interventions is needed to ensure those competitive markets. So this can range all the way from reducing barriers to entry to, as a very last resort, looking at the structure of markets and structural, whether or not there's a question around structural breakup. And this means, as I say, using the full set of regulatory tools that exist to ensure sufficient action is taken. An effective approach would look at reducing barriers to entry, it would look at efficient regulation and also structural interventions. And the correct approach will vary across sectors. And so what you need to do is think about each sector quite carefully, think about the sort of properties of that sector, the structure of that sector, and think about what's needed. The market studies play a really important role here. The Commerce Commission powers there are very welcome. These can go, this allows their work to go beyond just legal issues, but also to investigate how competition is working in a particular sector, and also to consider what policy options could be considered. And we see these sorts of approaches increasingly being used across OECD countries. In New Zealand, there's a case to look more closely at several key industries. We'd include dairy, retail electricity, ports, airports and airlines in that, and also retail financial services. As you can see here, for example, in retail banking, you can see how high banks' profits are in New Zealand compared to those in other countries, and that transaction fees and lending margins are high in New Zealand. A lack of competitive behaviour might be part of that story here. So we would say that it's important that the Commerce Commission continues with its market studies and continues to take that work forward. Another area that's important is digital markets. One of the important competition challenges across all OECD countries is adapting competition policy to the rapid expansion and evolution that we see. The risk of market dominance here is particularly high because of the economies of scale that quite often come with digital markets and the sort of winner-takes-all phenomenon that you see characterising those markets. This calls for tougher implementation of antitrust legislation than in other markets across economies. The challenges are obviously varied by country. For example, mobile phone data usage in New Zealand is one of the lowest we see in the OECD, and that of course reduces the opportunity for wide competition across digital markets. It limits sort of not just how, but also where people can access digital markets. And you can see in these charts just the low level in New Zealand compared to other OECD countries. The Commerce Commission needs the tools and capability to address digital platforms, market power, and the associated risks of competition. In this context, Australia is conducting a series of inquiries into markets for the supply of digital platform services, and we'll be doing that to the end of 2025. There may be some scope for engaging with that work to cooperate on digital market competition matters, and even considering a future single digital market between the two countries. We move on and talk about another of the themes that we've picked up in the survey, and that is around improving outcomes and equity in school education. So achievement in New Zealand's school education system has been declining since the early 2000s. The OECD PISA and other international and domestic tests consistently show that results have fallen significantly. Between 2009 and 2022, New Zealand's average score in the OECD's PISA tests fell by the equivalent of 2 years of maths education, 18 months worth of science education, or a year's worth of reading education. Obviously, this damages opportunities and well-being for young people from New Zealand, and the OECD analysis shows that aggregate productivity may fall by nearly as much as 4% as a result of these falls in education outcomes. Now in most countries, we saw the recent PISA results have fallen, and in part, but not just because of COVID-19 disruptions, but New Zealand's results have fallen by more than others. And not only has achievement declined, but inequality of outcomes remains high. So Maori and Pacifica children account for 25% and 13% of enrolled school children, and their performance remains far below the New Zealand and OECD averages. Obviously, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, reduced teacher expectations, and a weak sense of belonging contribute to some of these gaps. And outcomes for girls tends to be worse than boys in maths and science, and this later flows into the gender pay gaps that we see via career choices that children are making. So all of this points to an urgent need to improve the curriculum, to reform teacher education, and also to increase the participation in early childhood education. Each of those. So New Zealand has one of the highest variations in outcomes within schools in the OECD. There's two key specific reasons for this that we found. One is that the national curriculum here gives only very general guidance, and the other is insufficient detail on the content material and how to teach core subjects like reading, maths and science is provided in initial teacher education. So even in the same school, children could be learning quite different things as teachers have to do the design of what and how they teach themselves. It's quite easy for entire subtopics to be excluded or left out, resulting in children having significant holes in their knowledge or their competencies. So the reforms that we recommend will be to provide more specificity in the curriculum and the knowledge that children should acquire and to what level, and a greater focus should be given to core subject content in initial teacher education. And what this would do is it would improve the consistency of outcomes within and across schools and ensure that all children are being taught the things that they need and no one's being left out there. The devolved school system here has many strengths. But again, teachers are overstretched and given limited central guidance to support how to put policies into practice. We find teachers here are spending too much time on tasks where there's a strong potential for economies of scale, such as the selection of teaching materials. And as a result, as you can see in this chart, the share of teachers that report quite a lot or a lot of stress from implementing changing requirements is above that in many other OECD countries. They also report feeling more underprepared than teachers do in other countries. Now, the influence of socioeconomic background on student achievement is close to the OECD average in New Zealand, we find, and this partly reflects policies such as funding to offset socioeconomic disadvantages. But New Zealand could do better and move to amongst the best of the OECD countries like Canada and Norway in this regard. Improving participation in early childhood education is one of the most effective ways to offset the negative impact of lower socioeconomic background on achievement. Participation in New Zealand in early education from the ages of 3 to 5 is high overall compared to the OECD, as you can see in these charts, but it is lower by those from lower socioeconomic background, and so they will benefit, and those are the children that will benefit most from early education. The other thing we note about New Zealand is that parental payment for childcare as a percentage of income is one of the highest in the OECD, and there's also concerns about quality. So around a quarter of early education teachers surveyed said that they would not send their own child to the facility at which they work, and 45% said that staffing ratios are not being maintained. The final subject I was going to talk about this afternoon is climate change, both adaptation and reducing greenhouse gases. So we need to both adapt to living in a hotter world, and we also need to mitigate future warming. You can see here how climate change is already bringing more frequent extreme weather events to New Zealand. This chart shows unprecedented losses for agriculture and for people living close to the coast and to rivers. Currently, central government is acting as the insurer of last resort, the tax and the welfare system, and through ad hoc disaster recovery funds, but the growing losses of life and property from climate-related hazards call for a comprehensive policy toolkit to mitigate damage and to spread the cost of that damage more widely. So actions needed to ensure that people, businesses, buildings and infrastructure are less exposed and less vulnerable, and that they're more capable of adapting to hotter weather and extreme weather events. Insurance needs to play a big role in adaptation, and insurance coverage against flooding and other climate-induced extreme weather damage is currently very high in New Zealand, but premiums are rising, and the increased frequency of extreme weather means that insurance premiums may become too high for some properties, or coverage may be withdrawn altogether. So this is an area where we recommend careful monitoring to ensure that people and businesses can continue to maintain the high levels of coverage against climate-related damage that is needed, and that incentives to reduce risk are maintained. If necessary, and these costs rise, then reforms might be needed. Adaptation also requires investment in infrastructure, and these should be based on value for money analysis and considered against the alternatives like changes in land use, such as building in less flood-prone areas or having more green spaces. This will require both central and local government to have a lot more information about the risks and possible damage. And information and risk modelling capability needs to increase, including through closer working across central and local government. An efficient and effective planning system is necessary for effective adaptation actions, but the planning system at the moment, it hasn't coped well with urban expansion to accommodate a rapidly growing population. And some of the shortcomings that we see include insufficient revenue to fund resilient infrastructure, limited spatial planning, excessive public appeal rights and litigation in the system, and a lack of environmental data and capability to model climate risks. So New Zealand has seen slow development and a scarcity of land and housing to adapt to the high house prices that have been observed. And often developments have fewer green spaces and are less resilient to floods. Local government will need extra revenue to pay for more resilient infrastructure, and the planning system needs a more spatial approach with fewer legal appeal rights. And this will bring it into line with more closely into line with international practice. So just moving on to talk about emissions, New Zealand also needs to play its part in limiting future warming. New Zealand's approach to reducing emissions here could be more systematic. One of the key pillars of the emissions reduction plan is greater electrification of the transport and industrial sectors, which is welcome, but the approach to delivering this is quite partial, and so that is limiting the effectiveness. The chart on the left shows you that New Zealand has a lot of potential to increase emissions efficiency in transport, but as you can see on the right, by subsidising electric cars but not expanding the public charging network, that sort of high ratio of electric cars to chargers undermines the overall objective here of electrifying transport. A more systematic approach that thinks about policies together and compares costs and benefits would lead to a more effective and longer-term energy strategy. There is a strategy planned by the end of 2024, which is obviously welcome. Another factor for the New Zealand economy is that its structure means that emissions reductions challenges differs from in other OECD countries. As you can see in this chart, agriculture accounts for 48% of New Zealand's emissions, and 77% of that is methane animals. A successful emission strategy is going to need to take action here, and efficiency gains can't be offset by increases in livestock numbers. So the challenge here really is significant. New Zealand, as you can see, is already one of the most efficient producers of milk, beef and lamb in the world. You can see the milk data here. So reducing emissions further will be challenging, and further research and technological solutions will be needed. Despite significant progress, measurement has not advanced enough to allow detailed farm-level pricing yet, and on-farm measurement of emissions will need to be improved in preparation for introducing the pricing of agricultural emissions in some form to incentivise on-farm emissions reductions. Finally, the emissions reduction plan assumes that forest removals play a large role in meeting net emissions targets. You can see here the large gap between net and gross emissions in the chart, which demonstrates this. Forests are very attractive as planting certain forests reduces CO2 at a half to a quarter of the cost of many other emissions reduction options. But the treatment of forest removal in the emissions trading scheme has its shortcomings. So this should be reviewed and reformed in a number of ways. Firstly, to address that there are no limits currently on the quantity of forest units that may enter the ETS market. That's unique internationally. Second, to build in upward pressure on the price in the medium term to continue to drive gross emissions even lower. Third, to recognise and account for the issues around long-lived gases like CO2, including the vulnerability to risk of disease and fire, which will increase with climate change and vary by location. And finally, also to reflect the differences between exotic and native forests in terms of risks and durability. Consideration also needs to be given to the cost of land use changes away from agriculture, with potential social and economic implications for rural communities. So to conclude, the economy of New Zealand's been hit by the same shocks as other economies over previous years, very large and challenging shocks. And while growth is currently weak, we expect it to improve later this year and for New Zealand to grow more strongly in 2025. New Zealand faces many of the same structural challenges of other OECD countries, including low productivity growth, falling educational achievement, and adapting to a warmer world. But its unique location, geography, cultural mix, and economic structure means that these challenges have their own specific nature in this beautiful country. And the OECD stands ready to continue to work with New Zealand, sharing international best experience and helping to identify how this can be adapted to the challenges New Zealand faces. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, nau mai, haere mai, piki mai. It is a pleasure to be here today, and a particular pleasure to be participating in the launch of the OECD's 2024 Economic Survey of New Zealand, here in the Treasury's Whanganui, which is a visual representation of New Zealand's unique national identity. Here, I know you've come a very long way. Thank you for taking the trouble to present this survey in person, and thank you to you and the OECD for the thoroughness with which you have undertaken your two-yearly survey of the New Zealand economy. It won't surprise you to hear that the coalition government agrees with a great deal of what the OECD says, and we disagree with a few things. That's the point of the exercise. It gives us the chance to consider an expert external perspective and to test our thinking. You've all heard from Clare, and have had or will have the opportunity to read the full report. So I won't go through it in detail, but I will take the opportunity to highlight a handful of the findings. In the OECD's words, the economy is rebalancing. Rising interest rates and weaker growth are helping to curb inflation, but there has been a substantial deterioration in New Zealand's financial position. The OECD has put some facts on the table that should not be ignored. In its words, the causes of the deterioration in New Zealand's fiscal position are the pandemic and spending overruns. Together, they have led to a marked increase in the government spending to GDP ratio. Cycles happen, and economic shocks like pandemics, wars, and natural disasters are beyond the control of any New Zealand government. But controlling spending should be a bread and butter activity for every government. The reason we are currently grappling with a structural deficit is that the last government was unable to control its spending and stick to the allowances it set itself. As a result of this lax fiscal management, ours and future governments will be paying more money servicing debt and have less to invest in health, education, and law and order than would otherwise be the case. This reinforces the need for our government's approach of restoring fiscal  gradually closing the deficit through careful spending and ensuring that overdue tax relief is fully funded through revenue and reprioritisation measures. I want to touch briefly now on the three other areas the OECD has highlighted as warranting government attention: boosting competition and productivity, improving achievement and inclusion in education, and adapting to a warmer climate and reducing emissions. First, boosting competition and productivity. The OECD identifies competition as one of the most important drivers of long-term productivity growth. The government agrees, and we are looking to improve competition to unlock New Zealand's potential. We recently welcomed the release of the Commerce Commission's draft market study into personal banking services, and we are taking action to cut red tape and reduce barriers to market entry. We are also working on policy to ease our restrictive overseas investment regime so as to better support opportunities for growth and competition. We, as a coalition, have committed to a parliamentary inquiry into the state of personal banking in New Zealand, and we are prepared to take action. Second, education. Arguably, there is no other area in which governments can make a bigger difference to the prospects of their citizens. A good education is an escalator to a better life. But as the OECD observes, achievement in our schools is declining, attendance has dropped, and variance between student outcomes is high. The OECD identifies an urgent need to improve the curriculum, reform teacher education, and strengthen support for teachers and schools. I hope it won't have escaped the notice of many of you here that Education Minister Erica Stanford used pretty much the same language last week when she outlined the government's education priorities. They are a clearer curriculum, a better approach to literacy and numeracy, smarter assessment and reporting, improved teacher training, stronger learning support, and greater use of data. We want all our students to get a quality education and the skills to succeed no matter their circumstances. Third, climate change. New Zealand, like other countries, needs to address climate change on two fronts simultaneously. We need to reduce our emissions while also preparing for a hotter world and the challenges this will bring. The government agrees with the OECD about the need to reform land use planning and improve the on-farm measurement of agricultural emissions. We are in the process of reforming the resource management system, which will provide opportunities to better coordinate local, regional, and national spatial planning. And we've committed to measuring on-farm emissions from next year and to price them by 2030. Later this year, we will release our energy strategy, and we have committed to coordinated, cost-effective emission reduction initiatives, including boosting the rollout of the electric car charging network mentioned today. There are, of course, many other specific observations in this report, and I'm pleased to say that the government is already acting on many of them while giving our consideration to others. Naturally, as I said, we won't agree with the OECD about everything, but we welcome its expertise and the opportunity to have our thinking tested by it. Taken as a whole, this report reinforces the urgent need for our government to rebuild the New Zealand economy after a period of elevated spending, inflation, and interest rates. The government is on the right track with our plan to drive greater value from public spending, lift educational achievement, and to give businesses the confidence they need to invest, hire, and grow. This work to strengthen the economy will ultimately deliver New Zealanders the cost of living relief, higher incomes, and better public services they deserve. Clare, I'm sure we will have many more discussions with the OECD about all of these matters. Thank you again for the survey and for taking the trouble to present it personally. We will now all make ourselves available for your questions.
Minister, this report says that you should reduce the fiscal deficit. Why not spend or allocate the billions of dollars you're about to spend on tax cuts towards reducing the fiscal deficit?
We promised New Zealanders cost of living tax relief, and we will deliver it. We will also deliver on what this report suggests is necessary, which is gradually reducing that fiscal deficit in a way that is sustainable.
So are tax cuts just in your political best interest rather than in the economy's best interest?
I think they're in the economy's best interest and New Zealand's best interest. I think it would be wrong for the last person to get relief to be the working New Zealander. When we come to prioritising the targeted investments we will make in our upcoming budget, I'm proud that the people we are prioritising are low and middle income families, alongside investments in our health system, our education system, and tougher law and order. We will do all of that within a lower spending allowance than Labor had been promising, and we will do that with a plan to create fiscal sustainability in the medium term.
Do you not think it's a bit unfair to talk about that, given that you won't actually tell us what that operating allowance is?
Yes, I do think it's fair because I'll deliver our budget in just a few weeks and you will see a much smaller operating allowance than Labor was planning.
Well, you say much smaller. Well, what does much smaller mean? You've said below $3.5 billion. So are we talking 3.9? I know we've had this dance many times before, but let me put it another way. Would it be an operating allowance that the OECD would look at and say, good job?
I'm not going to give you the number today, but I will tell you three things that I think are useful. The first is not only will we post a smaller operating allowance, we will stick to it. That has not been the habit of the government in recent years. The second is we're not just focused on this year's budget, but on successive budgets. And we will track a path for fiscal consolidation in the medium term. The third thing is that I would highlight for you the observations in this report that the challenge New Zealand has faced in recent years has been something the OECD politely refer to as slippage. That is, finance ministers saying they'll do one thing and then going on to outspend it. And our government is going to be one of steady, consistent discipline, and you will see that.
Well, it's easy to stick to an operating allowance if you won't tell us what it is. We're going to find out on budget day, and it's not going to change in the course of a couple of minutes.
I have told you that it will be less than the 3.5 billion being planned.
How can we hold you accountable to less than something if we haven't got
You
a
can
figure?
hold me accountable to it being less than 3.5 billion, and it will be.
If Graham Robertson had said that, you'd be jumping up and down and saying that that's outrageous. Why is it the same? Why is it different for you?
Grant Robertson would consistently say one number and then spend considerably more.
Can
you assure that next year,
Janae,
can you assure that in next year's budget, this scenario won't happen again where you won't give a figure ahead of the budget?
at our budget, we will release not only the operating allowance for this fiscal year, but for the future fiscal years for the rest of the term. So yes, you will see our operating allowances that you can hold us to account for in this and successive budgets.
So at the next budget policy statement,
Yes, it will contain our operating allowance.
Has the Cabinet actually set the allowance yet? Because you said you wanted to wait to closer to the budget to do that.
Yes, it has.
This is another report. This report suggests that the government could be warranted in breaking up some big businesses, including foodstuffs and Woolworths New Zealand, to improve competition and increase productivity. Do you agree with that?
Well, I saw the flash headline from staff saying that the OECD had called for us to break up the supermarkets. I can't find that anywhere in the report. What the report actually says, so far as I read it, is that it says that the use of market studies is an important step and that we should be prepared to consider further intervention where necessary. So that is exactly the course of action we are following, which is that we received a market study into the grocery sector. We are now continuing further measures in the form of the Grocery Commissioner, and we are observing the effectiveness of those measures before we take any further action.
Perhaps the OECD could clarify, because I believe it does say that it mentions the term food break-up several times, also specifically in relation to the supermarket duopoly, saying wholesale reforms might not go far enough, and that might be a move that's that needs to be taken. So perhaps you can clarify.
So the minister's summary is correct. We advocate it not as a solution right now. It's more something to consider in a toolkit. And we do say that it's a tool of last resort, and it's a decision that needs to be taken by the government at cabinet level, because it can have very significant implications in terms of investor perceptions of New Zealand and so forth, and needs to be weighed very carefully against the costs in terms of when you do that, you're going to raise perhaps the fixed costs because you're losing some economies of scale when you break up and so forth. So we very much characterise it as a tool of last resort, but something that should be considered carefully in a sort of strategy of gradual escalation.
Okay, thank you. The report also joins the IMF in calling for capital gains tax reform. So joining the IMF, we're reiterating a statement, I guess, that the OECD's made, for at least the last 10 years, I suppose that should perhaps be looked at, and joining the former government's tax working groups considerations on that. You suggested, indicated that perhaps the return to surplus might need to be delayed by a further 2 years. With that advice coming through, isn't there something to consider there?
We're embarking on the program of tax reform we were voted to deliver, and we are prioritising personal income tax reduction. That is what we took as a platform to New Zealand voters, and that is the platform we are delivering on.
Minister, just on the lack of competition in our economy, given the Commerce Commission has already looked into a number of sectors, is there any other area that you think they need to consider?
Well, look, you will have seen the Commerce Commission, the Commerce Minister has made statements about that. We have a program of market studies underway. We are watching the grocery sector very carefully to see whether the Grocery Commissioner is satisfied with the level of competition there. We currently have a market study happening into banking in New Zealand. Again, we will watch the recommendations of the Commerce Commission with interest, and we're already taking advice on the preliminary recommendations that they have made. Further market studies will undoubtedly follow, and this report today provides a marker of some of the sectors we could consider.
If you don't pick up the recommendation on capital gains tax, which obviously you're not going to, how then do you address this graph in here, figure 2.15, which is headed, without policy change, public debt will rise markedly? And that's related, the capital gains proposal is related directly to the impact of expenditure on an ageing population, which is consistent with Treasury's long-term fiscal outlook, etc. How do you address that rising debt if you don't address revenue?
Well, we will deliver it through getting better value for money out of public spending. And what you will see in the long-term projections which we present is that when you provide more discipline to government spending, over time you can reduce that deficit and therefore reduce public debt. We've had a track record in this country in recent years of government spending ever more and yet not solving problems. The answer to every problem is not a new tax. Sometimes the answer is to spend New Zealanders' money better, and that is what our government is intent on doing.
You're keeping to your allowances, as you say, in the face of a major natural disaster.
I think that it's right to highlight that if there was a major natural disaster which required emergency response from the government, that would be an extraordinary circumstance which could warrant a larger operating allowance. And when I release our operating allowances on budget day, I will be careful to make that caveat. But it has to be a tight caveat, Jim, because otherwise you get what we had in recent years, which was a finance minister who treated the signalled operating allowance as an aspirational goal that he never, ever met. And we can't afford to continue down that path.
Let's speak to the OECD suggestion about a new kind of fiscal target to create more transparency around that whole thing.
I'm really interested in picking up on that suggestion because I think there's a couple of things that we as a government are working to do. The first is get the books back in balance, and we have an Obergall surplus target there. The second is our goal to reduce government spending as a proportion of GDP to get it back down to 30%. But as you appreciate, how big GDP is really has a big impact on that percentage figure. So looking at a nominal target in terms of how we are reporting to New Zealanders on our spending, I think could be useful. I view the operating allowance as that binding constraint. And so I'll be reflecting.
It's not binding if you've got a natural disaster, which is going back to exactly what Labor did. They're saying it's a disaster.
I disagree because I think that Labor exceeded their operating allowances even outside of extraordinary natural events.
We've seen a number of, in fact, most government agencies come out with how they plan on starting the public sector cuts that you want them to do before the budget or whatever the time frame might be. One of the agencies that's been absent from that so far is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Will we be seeing some cuts from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs soon?
Well, I can confirm that the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade has taken part in the exercise and will be delivering efficiencies as part of the budget.
Will it be 6.5 or 7.5%?
I haven't revealed to you the number for any agency. What I've consistently said is some agencies have not been able to find the savings we targeted without compromising frontline services. Others have gone above and beyond and have identified a range of programs, which mean that together we will hit our overall target, but it's necessarily nuanced.
That's a change in language you've said before. It's been 6.5 or 7. So you're saying foreign affairs is not part of 6.5 or 7, it's 5.5.
Absolutely, it was part of the same program where we set a target for every agency of either 6.5 or 7.5. What I've also consistently said is not every agency will hit that target. And that's because when they came to ministers with their proposals for what would be required to reach it, for some, it would have meant removing programs that we weren't happy to see removed. And so what we've done is in some areas we've pushed harder where there's more waste or there's more low value spending. And in other areas we've compromised. Altogether, it means we'll hit our savings target, but we'll do it in a way that's nuanced and reflects, I think, New Zealanders' pride.
The obvious question from that is that Winston Peters has pushed back and you've said that's fine, your agency is exempt.
No, I think that's the wrong conclusion.
The super fund contributions, will those be maintained at the same rate as they currently are?
So the rate obviously is set in legislation and we haven't changed the legislation.
Okay, so will you, I mean, and excuse me, I don't have the wording of it, so don't try to, provide an answer that catches us out. But
I'm just giving you a straight answer. We haven't changed that.
Sorry, I don't know the formula off the top of my head, but what I'm saying is, will the government reduce the contributions proportionately?
The contribution rates in this budget will be at the level set in legislation.
Okay.
Given the experience you've just had with the fiscal surprises, etc., from the last government, and I'm just a little bit confused from the last term as to whether or not you supported or didn't support an independent fiscal institution reporting to Parliament. And given that it's now recommended in this report, is one on the cards? Would you support one?
I'm saying that I am considering it and I'm interested in it. To give you a bit more of a sense of my thinking. On the one hand, I think we already in New Zealand have quite an independent Treasury. Certainly I've experienced its independence in recent things. And in terms of the forecasting function and its ability to hold the government to account for its fiscal and economic strategy, it's at the more independent level of the scale when compared to the OECD. Many of the countries in the OECD. And what I wouldn't want to do is have lots of institutional duplication and new layers of bureaucracy. At the same time, do I see a case for increased fiscal scrutiny in the future, both through Parliament and potentially through another entity? Yeah, I can see there could be that case. So I'm interested about how we can achieve that in a low cost way. And one of the thoughts I have had is about the role of the Auditor General, who already independently advises parliamentary select committees and who potentially could do some more of that. I've also previously indicated my interest in some sort of independent costings unit so that our election campaigns can be more about the big philosophical economic arguments and less about decimal places. And that is something I intend to pick up with the opposition.
What is
We've got time for one more question, thanks.
I've got one for Clare and the OECD, so you come all this way.
Thank you.
Our economy is obviously growing pretty slowly and is in pretty bad shape. That largely is due to interest rates bringing down inflation. Do you see any reason or any structural problem in the economy that we won't rebound to our previous growth rate once interest rates normalise? I guess I'm asking, do you think there's any deterioration in the structural settings of our economy, or can we expect once interest rates normalise to bounce back at least to our previous growth rate?
No, obvious.
Can I ask you to stand up? Sorry, excuse me. Is that right? So, just the microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's no evidence to expect that the structural rate of trend growth in the economy will be different at the end of this economic cycle than it was at the start. But what is clear is that that level of trend growth is a lot less than it was, say, before the global financial crisis. So it's still the case that, New Zealand, like many advanced economies, needs to be thinking about what are the things that will get that trend growth rate up. Including, as we said today, education, competition, and those sorts of issues. But there's no particular reason to think that the nature of the shocks that have here and so that downturn will lead to a lower level of trend growth than before.
And do you also agree with the Reserve Bank's outlook that it's too soon to cut interest rates, even though inflation is tracking down? You don't think they're overcooking their monetary policy?
No, we agree. It's more evidence that inflation is consistently coming back to that target before we start loosening monetary policy in New Zealand at the moment, and that's why we've got the advice that we have, which is give it a bit more time, and then you can be able to loosen once inflation is clearly further back towards the target.
Thank you. Dr. Lombardelli and Mr. Willis.